So let's talk about the power of the biggest and chunkiest Primaris around, with a focused look at Gravis Armour units in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at Gravis Armour, and what these beautifully chunky Space Marines can do when they're put on the tabletop. In the lore, Gravis Armour is a variant on the Mark X armour worn by the Primaris Space Marines in the evolution of Power Armour. Designs have been progressed and upgraded over the armour's marks, though in the Indomitors era it took a slightly different form. The Mark X armour had the innovation of being able to be customised more towards a unit's battlefield role, giving options like the lightweight and slightly stealthier Phobos armour, the standard plates of the Tacticus armour, and of course the heavily reinforced Gravis armour, incorporating far thicker ceramite plating, and often deployed when Space Marines are going to be fighting at extreme close quarters, sacrificing an element of mobility for a lot better protection. As a result, Gravis armour is particularly impervious to enemy small arms, not quite to the same level as Terminator armour, though it's far easier to manufacture and replace parts for, and has also been used for other battlefield roles as well, such as the meteoric drops of the Inceptors hurtling down from the upper atmosphere. Miniature-wise, Gravis armour was at least fairly well received by the fans. The first examples of it came out very early in the Primaris range, getting us Inceptors, the Gravis Captain, and Aggressors, all in the first few months of 8th edition, and since then their battlefield lineup has been expanded by heavy Intercessors and Eradicators, plus a few other characters as well. When it first launched, I did feel like it was basically Games Workshop trying to make the equivalent of a Primaris Terminator. Particularly the Aggressors felt like that, chunky armoured elites both with high rate of fire bolt weapons and power fists. There's quite a lot of design overlap, though it seems that in general fans seem to see differences a bit more than the similarities. I think it's a good decision that they kept both around. In-game in 10th edition 40k, it grants the Space Marine a toughness 6, so really able to shrug off quite a lot of small arms fire, but still kind of vulnerable to things like special weapons and anti-tank shots. They get an extra wound as well, so 3 wounds at toughness 6, though the save remains a 3+ rather than a 2+ like Terminator armour. Per model, the Terminators do tend to be considerably tougher. The extra weight comes with a little bit less movement, normally 5 inches for most units, though even the jump pack Inceptors move a bit slower, going 10 rather than 12, and they're kind of similar to Terminators for transport, taking up 2 slots in things like Land Raiders, and they can't ride in smaller ones like Rhinos or Impulsors. Space Marines have quite a lot of armour types and different flavours of character, though it is kind of notable that the options for the Gravis armour are a bit more limited than some. Phobos armour has got rather a lot, such as combi weapon lieutenants, regular lieutenants and captains and librarians, whereas for generic characters Gravis only has the standard captain with 2 different miniature sculpts and then the Apothecary Biologis. It maybe feels a little bit odd that in particular we don't have a lieutenant in Gravis armour, despite Games Workshop releasing absolutely tons of those models, and also we've never had anything like a chaplain or librarian in Gravis, though they did redo them for the Terminators when they came out in 10th. I wouldn't be too surprised if they keep on developing the Gravis range when they release new launch boxes though. Space Marines are about as guaranteed as it's possible to be to get new releases each and every edition. Let's look through the actual Gravis units in Codex Space Marines, and starting out we'll go with the battle line troops in the heavy Intercessor squad. There are 100 points per 5 of them and 200 points per 10. I feel they are an interesting unit, genuinely not too bad in casual play, though they very rarely make it into competitive lists. Your standard Gravis troops have 3 wounds at toughness 6 as mentioned, these guys have a big OC2. And then in the squad they get to lay down fire with their heavy bolt rifles, essentially boosted versions of the regular Intercessor ones, with the assault and heavy keywords but longer range and a strength 5. They also get 1 heavy bolter per 5 in the unit, though no special weapon on the sergeant, and their core rule helps them out against damage 1 fire, giving them an extra +1 to their armor save against them, all very unyielding in the face of the foe there. The heavy Intercessors generally feel like they've been in a slightly awkward place. They've got good defensive stats, but otherwise a profile that sort of wants to be loitering towards the back of the board. But then if they do go there, they've got low damage output, and the opponent is most likely just going to ignore them and focus on just about anything else as a priority. If they move up to the mid-board, then I guess their durability might get dealt with, but they're just not quite as well suited to being right on the front line, having no special melee weapon like a power fist. So scrapping around in close combat is going to mean that they don't even get their bolt rifle damage. Overall, I really don't think they're a bad deal for their raw unit and stats, but for most battlefield roles I think you could easily argue a different unit out of the many in Codex Space Marines could do a bit better for that one. If you're going for high value backfield objective grabbers, people tend to prefer infiltrators. That 12-inch deep strike denial is rather godly to have in your backfield and seems to outweigh a bit more durability. It perhaps doesn't help enormously as well that probably their most favoured detachment would be the Anvil Siege Force, where those bolt rifles can get a good amount of extra damage, +1 to wound if they can stay stationary, as well as the +1 to hit, and then potentially they could be one of the best users of that Lieutenant combo, where you can get both sustained and lethal hits on a 5+ if they remain static. They're perhaps one of the best users of that combo, as they're actually chunky enough just to stand right out in the open and stand and shoot, whereas other things like Hellblasters might just get focused down as an absolute top priority if they try and do that. Overall though, I think there's a lot to like about them, certainly usable casually, though I'd probably rate them a little bit mid in terms of competitive use. I've given them a 6.5 out of 10 for a rough power rating here. Before we go on, if you were looking to pick up any Gravis Armoured Space Marines or anything else for Warhammer 40k, I'd just like to mention that I do have the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked down in the video description, which can be one way to help support the channel if you were picking up some Warhammer things or other hobby supplies anyway. The ones listed here are Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10% off, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15% off, and Tash and Geldeep in the EU, based in Germany. A big thank you to any of you who do choose to use those links when you're picking up some 40k miniatures. It's one of the things that allows me to keep on making these videos full time. Back to the March of the Gravis units though, and next up we have the Aggressors, chunky power armour armed with dual power fists with inbuilt bolt guns or flamers, the same sort of stat line as their heavy Intercessors, and at range each one either gets d6+1 auto hits with twin linked with the Flamestorm gauntlets, or at strength 4 AP0 damage 1, or 3 twin linked shots and then a blast d6 shot at 18 inches with the auto bolt storm and the Fragstorm grenade combo, having a high volume of fire, but you do need to roll to hit and it doesn't ignore cover. All of those shots get an extra AP by 1 against the nearest target, which is pretty handy given that they're AP0 at base, and then in melee they follow that all up with some twin linked power fists, 3 attacks at strength 8, AP2 and damage 2, which with the reroll to wound is really quite a nice generalist profile, pretty guarantees to land at least some nasty damage on an enemy unit. At 120 points though, that does mean that they're actually genuinely very fragile for the cost. Just a few big failed saves could take out a lot of points of models, but if they're in a big unit with some character buffs and maybe some stratagems going off on them and they get to shoot and then charge, they could kill a massive chunk of the enemy army in one fell swoop. Aggressors seem to be one of the best units that can run in big combos in armies. They like the fire discipline in Gladius, where you give them that enhancement on the Apothecary Biologis, and then they can get sustained and lethal hits on a 5+ with all their shooting, meaning that a squad of them with Boltstorm gauntlets can easily threaten to take down battle tanks, never mind anything weaker. In Firestorm Assault Force, a squad of 6 of them with flamers can be very nasty indeed, all at strength 5 within 12 inches, and then they can either get a +1 to wound or devastating wounds on 6s, which can again make them have a good chance to burn down battle tanks. They can combo quite well with the captain there. Or perhaps in Vanguard Spearhead, they can often join Marneus Calgar alongside an Apothecary Biologis with the Infiltrate trait and deploy in the midfield for a fantastically scary shooting and melee unit that the opponent can't really afford to ignore and might struggle to kill a good chunk of in one turn in one focal location. Then hopefully, unless you're infiltrating in different detachments, maybe put them in a Land Raider, and that can be a nice way to deliver them in safety to the enemy. Overall, with their price tag at the moment, I feel like they are the sort of unit that you do need to build around, invest more points, leaders and stratagems in making them good, but are the sort of unit that can justify that investment. I've chosen to give them an 8.5 out of 10 here, as they're really quite a usable competitive unit for some of the better Space Marine detachments. Next up, we've got the anti-tank melter powerhouses that are the Eradicator squad. Again, they've got that standard Gravis profile at toughness 6 with 3 wounds, and then per set of 3 of them, they're equipped with 2 melter rifles, single shots at strength 9 AP4 and damage D6, but an 18-inch range, and a multi-melter which you get 1 per 3 of, hitting on a 4+ with the heavy keyword, but 2 shots to that same range otherwise. On its own, that wouldn't really be all that much, but their special rule is just kind of massive. If they shoot against a monster or vehicle model, then they get to reroll hit rolls, wound rolls, and damage rolls. And when you do the maths on that special rule, I believe for standard units it has them as the single best anti-tank firepower unit against a lot of common vehicle profiles, at least in terms of the points cost for anything in Codex Space Marines. That is maybe kind of expected though, given that they need to get kind of closer to 18 inches to deal that damage, and ideally want to be within 9 for melter rules if they can, and they're just really not all that fast to deliver that shooting into combat. Might want some other protection like a transport, and getting them locked up in combat could be a big deal. For detachment options, Firestorm is rather good for them. It gets them to be able to advance and shoot, so a much bigger threat range there. Plus if they get within 12 inches, that goes up to strength 10, and that means that they're so much more punchy against common vehicle targets. Plus having access to Crucible of Battle for a +1 to wound isn't awful. Could easily be worth it if you're wounding a Land Raider on a 4+ and re-rolling that wound roll. They're pretty nice in Gladius Task Force as well. Again, they can advance and shoot there, and could be an alternative option to use the Fire Discipline combo on when paired with an Apothecary Biologis. They work well in transports as well, maybe jumping out of a Repulsor or Land Raider Redeemer, or could use Strategic Reserve against some armies as another way of getting that melter on target. Overall, I've chosen to give them an 8.5 out of 10 for rough power rating. Again, pretty efficient, and they do their job really quite well. I feel like you likely wouldn't want to overinvest on them though, given their weaknesses and that they're just not all that general purpose against other targets. Next up, we've got the Inceptors. These guys are the jump Gravis Armour, and with that they have the fly keyword, get to deep strike, and then move 10 inches rather than the normal 5 that the others do. The Inceptors strike with their twin pistols, either the Assault Bolters or the Plasma Exterminators. Either you get 3 shots at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2 with sustained hits 2, or 2 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2 with the plasma, again both of them twin linked. Both of the variants of the weapons do get played quite a lot. The Assault Bolters are better against Marine equivalents and anything lighter, which might often be where they're dropping, but the plasma is stronger against heavier targets and elite infantry like Terminators, so pretty nice that they're both quite usable. Inceptor's main thing is their Meteoric Descent rule, where you can drop anywhere on the table that's outside of 3 inches of enemies, which means that they're near enough impossible to screen, so you could basically guarantee some good damage on just any one unit that you absolutely need it on the board, or could have them drop into a location to do a secondary objective that your army just otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. They are paying a premium for it, but can be near enough guaranteed victory points. For detachment buffs, perhaps the Vanguard Spearhead could be one of the single most notable ones for them. That one allows them to return to reserve, so you can basically have them warping around the table. At least in theory land, you could have a big squad of them drop next to an enemy unit, wipe it out, and hopefully still remain somewhere safe that the enemy can't hit them back too hard, and then have them return to reserves to do it all over again. For that same reason, as it stands, they're looking kinda terrifying in the Blood Angels Angelic Host detachment. Again, that one can allow lots of units just to return to reserves absolutely for free. Plus has a few other good rules for supporting units dropping in, and it feels like the Inceptors are going to be very scary there. Finally, Firestorm I think is interesting enough for them. The +1 strength helps out the gun profiles, but also being able to use things like Crucible of Battle just to double down on their damage output against something that they really needed it on, that could also be very good. For a rough power rating, I seem to have rated them the same as the previous two, an 8.5 out of 10. Definitely can be a useful unit in competitive lists, and they do get play. For the secondary objective role though, a lot of people like to run jump intercessors for a drop threat that can do grunt work. They don't get the amazing 3-inch drop, but they do move a bit faster, still have some okay damage, and above all are a lot cheaper, so a bit more efficient with doing things like actions if they need to. Moving on to the Gravis characters next, and first up we have the Captain in Gravis Armour. He's 80 points, and he's had a few incarnations over the years. First he had the Monopose model that came out in the Dark Imperium box set that launched the Primaris, and then was followed up by 2 different miniatures, the one with a heavy bolt rifle, and this one that you can see pictured, pairing a Bolt Storm gauntlet with extra attacks either from a Relic Blade, Power Fist or Chainsword. Out of those I'd likely be tempted most by the Relic Blade. A couple of attacks at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2 seems like the most useful generalist of those profiles, though there's not crazy amounts in it. Otherwise he gets his standard discounted stratagems for being a captain, modified to being the -1 command point cost, and he's also extra tanky when he's isolated, halving damage of incoming attacks, which could be kind of fun with certain Feel No Pain type relics out there. There's a few that can give him a 5+ or 4+1. For units that he can lead, it's either Aggressors, Heavy Intercessors, or Eradicators, and out of those it only really feels like the Aggressors that have a massive natural fit with him. His profile is just clearly a melee one and wants to be getting involved in close combat alongside them, whereas the other units have a lot more conflict of interest as to whether or not they want to get their kind of weak melee profiles charging up close and personal with the enemy. He can be pretty scary alongside Aggressors though, perhaps most tempting alongside a Firestorm Assault Force, giving a bunch of Flamestorm Aggressors devastating wound torrents for 1 command point, or giving them the option of +1 to wounds. He can bear enhancements for the squad as well, such as the Firestorm one that flips a dice to a 6. Overall I'd say he's usable enough, though really quite detachment dependent. I've chosen to rate him a 7.5 out of 10 here. Next up, we've got the Apothecary Biologis, the Apothecary Scientist sort of character from the Leviathan box. 55 points for a Battlefield Analyst, having a 5 wound Gravis profile with OC3 at base, which is a bit more than most characters, though not really a lot of personal damage threat, an Absolver Bolt Pistol for a single strength 5 damage 2 shot, and then 4 attacks with a close combat weapon in melee. If his unit slays something in melee, then he gets a big OC of 9, which is alright but kind of unreliable to trigger. Really, he's taken for being a cheap character to give his unit lethal hits, essentially pretty much making him the Gravis Lieutenant even if they don't really have one. Those lethal hits are usable enough by literally any of the Gravis Armour variants, though if you're taking Flamestorm Aggressors, then you're probably best off with a Captain, given that lethal hits don't work on their Flamer attacks. It's very nice on Boltstorm Gauntlets though, and particularly in Gladius with the whole Fire Discipline thing that they can do. Again, he can bear the enhancement that can give them both sustained and lethal hits on a 5+ with a stratagem, and then use Oath of Moment so you get a whole ton of 5+s. I've certainly seen people using him with Eradicators as well though. Fairly scary to be adding yet more damage to the whole equation with lethal hits. Not too bad when they might be wounding some tougher vehicles on a 5, and could maybe be worth considering alongside heavy intercessors in Anvil Siege Force if you're trying to make it work. He can attach alongside Calgar as well, so as mentioned can make a very scary Aggressor Death Star for Vanguard infiltrating. Overall I think he's a solid character for the points cost that maybe needs a specific detachment to make him truly stand out. Again, I've given him an 8.5 out of 10, really quite usable. Talking of Calgar, he is the biggest, scariest threat in Gravis Armour that we have so far. 185 points for his unit of 3, fighting alongside 2 Victrix Honour Guards, though they're very disappointed to be wearing Tacticus armour for the purposes of this video. Marneus Calgar is one of the single most efficient Space Marine characters. The fact that he comes with those guards just means that he turns pretty much any unit that he attaches to into a scary threat, and the different defensive profiles can be quite good for tanking damage as well, particularly with those guards having a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, which means that they could be tanking some fire that might otherwise really easily slay things like Aggressors. He personally gets some twin link shooting at damage 2, 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 twin linked in melee with the gauntlets. The Victric guards back him up with 10 attacks at strength 5 and damage 2. He allows his units to advance and charge, advance and shoot, fall back and shoot, and fall back and charge. So essentially all of the Gravis doctrines rolled into one, and that can be quite nice for getting aggressors closer to the enemy. We can also join things like Company Heroes and Blade Guard if he wants to. Finally, to cap it all off, he also gets a 1 command point generation per turn. Always going to be pretty massive value wherever that turns up. It maybe just gives him a little bit more incentive to be walking around on the board as opposed to being hidden away in a transport where it doesn't work. Overall, he's a bit of a powerhouse, and I've rated him a 9 out of 10 here. Moving on, for the Imperial Fist, we've got Tor Garadon. 90 points for a Gravis Captain of Dornian descent, a 6 wound character with a 4+ invulnerable save. He's basically a dedicated anti-heavy specialist, not giving a particularly good buff to his squad with his Signum Array. It was a bit sad when it lost lethal hits in the Space Marine Codex, though giving Ignor's cover isn't nothing. It does help out Boltstorm Aggressors. His big rule though is that whenever he makes an attack that targets monsters, vehicles or fortifications, all his attacks gain +2 strength, +2 AP and an extra +2 damage, which means that he's actually really quite a big threat to them both at range and in melee. As against vehicles, that Gravgon profile that he has 2 attacks that hit on a 2+, wound on a 2+, and then are AP 4 and damage 4, meaning he's got a pretty reasonable chance of just launching 8 damage into a vehicle with a 3+ save, if he can get range and line of sight on one. In melee, he strikes with the Hand of Defiance, 5 attacks hitting on a 2 at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 2. Not too bad at skirmishing with medium infantry, though again it's going to be next level when attacking tough stuff. Strength 14, AP 4 and damage 4 is an altogether very different profile. He does just really seem quite matchup dependent though. If you absolutely knew that you were going up against an army of vehicles, he could well be worth the cost. Against the more general meta though, it's going to feel pretty disappointing, compared with something that could have given the squad a few more buffs, say the Apothecary Biologis or the standard captain. I've chosen to give him a 6 out of 10 as a result. Kind of rare to see him in any sort of tournament list, even if against vehicles he is very scary indeed. Finally, in representing the Iron Hands, we have the Gravis Armoured Iron Father that is Iron Father Feirros. 95 points for another 6 wound character, this guy with a 2+ save but no invulnerable. At range he strikes with Gorgon's Wrath, a sustained hits 2 heavy bolter that hits on a 2+, and then is fairly punchy in melee for a model that feels like a tech specialist. 6 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, and then another 2 with his servo arms, hitting at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3. Beyond that though, he's kind of an interesting unit in having 2 genuinely quite good buffs, but that just don't really go together super well. First up, he has his Rites of Tempering, giving his unit a 5+ Feel No Pain type save. Not too bad on chunky Gravis profiles, though I feel like if you're putting him in a unit of Eradicators or Aggressors, it's still not necessarily going to make you a unit that's particularly efficient for durability, not when you account for the points cost. His second boost is helping out vehicles much like Tech Marines, giving you a +1 to hit, and then instead of healing D3 wounds, healing a big 3 wounds onto his target. That can be very meaningful on a bunch of Space Marine vehicles out there. Redemptor Dreadnoughts certainly get on well with that, given their -1 damage making it hard to take wounds off in the first place, as would things like Repulsor Executioners or maybe Land Raiders. At least in theory land, if you manage to do that twice over the course of the game, he'd already go quite a long way to having justified his points cost, never mind if he gets his damage profile to work later. I feel like to actually make him efficient, he needs to make use out of both of his buffs, and it seems that on paper perhaps the best way of doing that would be to run him with a 5-man squad of heavy intercessors. That way he'd have a unit that's just under 200 points that could maybe advance up the board alongside some dreadnoughts. Feirros can get to work at making them extra accurate and regrow wounds at an alarming rate. His squad is just going to be incredibly irritating to remove, with 15 Gravis wounds and a 5+ Feel No Pain for just 100 points on the Intercessors part, and then hopefully they could use their objective control to good use on the midfield objectives, where Feirros could actually make them into somewhat of a melee threat and less bad on the front line. Overall feels like that little formation could feel at least fairly efficient, though maybe it is a bit warping to build your entire army around that sort of thing. Otherwise though, if you're looking for a bit more of a just dedicated vehicle support unit, Tech Marines just feel way more efficient for that role for just 55 points, so it does feel like if you want to justify the extra spend, then you would need to get good use out of his melee and his toughness rules. Overall, again, very rarely seen in competitive lists. I'd rate him a 6 out of 10 overall though. I don't think he's useless, just a bit overshadowed by other options and a bit restrictive with the way that you need to play him. In any case though, I'll leave that there for a few thoughts on Gravis Armour. Let me know your guys' takes on the units and whether or not you've tried to use any mass Gravis forces in Warhammer 40k 10th so far. I can't help but think it would be kind of hilarious to try out just putting mass Gravis with something like 60 heavy intercessor bodies on the board and just seeing if the enemy could chew through all that. I feel like in reality though, the low damage output and getting them tied up in combat most likely would probably cause a few issues. In any case, let me know any of your Gravis related insights down in the comments. And as mentioned earlier, feel free to check out the discount retailers if you happen to be picking up any 40k things in the future. They're linked below in the video description. Save a bit of money versus Games Workshop and do help to support the channel a little. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new videos most days. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.